Here we come a-wassailing among the leaves so green. Here we come a-wandering so fair to be seen. Love and joy come to you, and to you your wassail too. And God bless you and send you a happy new year. And God send you a happy new year. Well, if my singing hasn't run you off, then by now you already know that this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee. And in today's episode, we're going to be taking a look into the history, the practices, and the beverage, all of which are known as Wassail. But, most importantly, I figure, we are going to find out just what the heck that word means. So come along with me as we go a-wassailing. The song with which I previously assaulted your ears with dates back to the mid-19th century. However, it could possibly be older. But the word wassail mentioned in the song is considerably older, tracing its etymological roots as far back as being born of a combination of the Old Norse and Old English languages. Now, the phrase Wassail, which is a salutation meaning to be in good health or be fortunate, was by the 12th century considered specifically to be an Anglo-Dane or Anglo-Saxon characteristic. And the first mention of this, or at least the earliest one to have survived to our time, was found around 1140 AD, in Geoffrey of Monmouth's telling of the story of Rowena, the daughter of Hengist, the Anglo-Saxon chief, and wife of Vortigern, king of the Britons. At a banquet hosted by Vortigern, Rowena presents herself before the king, bowing low with a goblet of spiced wine, and says, "Wassail," to which the king takes, drinks, and says, "Drink hail." And from that day to this is a custom that is still endured at many traditional types of parties in England, wherein the first man at the head of the table to take a drink from the wassail bowl, or just in general, says "Wassail," and then passes the goblet on, to which his partner will reply, "Drink hail." But by the year 1300, the phrase wassail or wassail at this point had become rather more of the go-to phrase for a beverage as opposed to a toast. And this we see people could make with spiced wine, cider, or ale. Now, these particular recipes, they tended to be praised very heavily, especially in one notable mention from Robert Herrick's Twelfth Night, written in the 1600s, to which he quotes, "A health to the king and queen here. Next crown the bowl full with gentle lamb's wool. Add sugar, nutmeg, and ginger, and store of ale too, and thus ye must do to make the wassail a swinger." Now, when he says to crown the bowl full with gentle lamb's wool, obviously he is not referencing the actual wool of a young sheep. Rather, this is in reference to sort of the texture of the apples that would be added to the bowl for flavoring. And their texture and the look of it resembled somewhat of the curly nature of a sheep's wool. But also, Robert Herrick provides us with a better insight as to why it was called lamb's wool. And if you'll bear with me. All right, one page over. Aha! You would think if I had this bookmarked already that I would be better able to find it. That's not the case, not all the time, my friends. But Robert Herrick says here that lamb's wool is merely a variety of the wassail bowl. Formerly, the first day of November was dedicated to the angel presiding over fruits, seeds, etc., and was therefore pronounced Lamasul, that is, the day of the apple fruit. And being pronounced Lamasul, our country people have corrupted it to lamb's wool. But if you look at the actual correspondence between both of the mentions of Robert Herrick's work, then you'll notice that they both mention not just any bowl in particular, a wassail bowl. Now, wassail bowls could be rather plain, such as the one you see seated before you, or they could be rather fanciful and ornate. One such example of the extravagant was one that dates back to the 17th century, built by the Worshipful Guild of Grocers. And this one was decorated with silver and was so large that it must have been passed around as what they called a love cup, which meant that all the men assembled there in the society could drink freely from that cup, and they wouldn't have to worry about running out. But then we see the other examples of somewhat less ornate and rather plain wassail bowls being mentioned in certain poems and songs. For example, the Gloucestershire Wassail, which sings to the effect of, "Our bowlet is made of the white maple tree, with a wassailing bowl we'll drink unto thee." However, white maple is not native to Europe, so this must have actually been in a mistaken reference to either sycamore or field maple, both of which are native to Europe and both of which have white-looking wood. And in the 1890s, there was a man who reaffirms this particular theory because he writes about the wassail bowl that his friend in Gloucestershire owns, to which he says that the bowl is made of a plain white-looking wood which is normally used to hold potatoes on the farm kitchen table. But regardless of whether or not you had a fanciful bowl or, well, this little fellow that I have right here, then it would be filled to the brim with lamb's wool. And then people would go about wassailing. Now, originally, when it came to the practice of wassailing, we see that, at least in medieval times, it was not necessarily the tradition that it came to be known and loved by as far as the 1800s. Rather, this was more of a simple going from door to door, singing and asking for food and drink, and typically it was an agreement based upon a mutual trust between the feudal lords and their peasants. They would come up to the house, they would sing a couple of wassailing songs, and the lord would give them food and drink in kind. On occasion, he would actually give them money. But but we see that this is not to be considered begging, because in the song "Here We Come A-Wassailing," there is a distinction to be made from begging as opposed to the recipient-based gift-giving that we actually see in the traditions there. And that is the lyric which says, "We are not daily beggars who beg from door to door, but we are friendly neighbors whom you have seen before." So, in other words, they're not coming to try and bleed you dry or bleed you white. They are just simply coming up for a little bit of an extra Christmas bonus, if you will. But around the time of the 16 and 1700s, the practice of wassailing would go from this recipient-based gift-giving to a rather rowdy affair. And it would resemble more of, how the original trick-or-treat would go, as opposed to a quaint and pleasant Christmas tradition. Now, the original wassailing tradition owes its roots and origins to pagan traditions, wherein people would go out to the apple orchards with their wassail bowl and their cups, and they would dip in, and then they would toast and drink to the tree spirits to awaken the cider spirits. And then afterwards, they would pour out the rest of their wassail cup onto the roots of the tree to awaken it and to ward off the evil tree spirits. In later years, the baby Jesus, as opposed to the tree spirits, would be invoked to ensure a fruitful harvest in autumn. But once the wassail was poured out onto the roots of the tree itself, then the wassailing ceremony was effectually completed. And from there, they would fire off a volley of gunfire and start to make their way into the town. As the tipsy toasters made their way into the town, they would then go ahead and make their way to the homes of the wealthy, in which they burst in through the door, demanding figgy pudding and good cheer, i.e. the wassail beverage, without which they would not leave. And this is evidenced in the song which mentions, "We won't go until we get some, so bring some out here." Now, if you were the homeowner and you refused these people, you could be cursed, and in fact your house could be vandalized. And this is why, even though the practice of wassailing had taken root in the early Americas in the 1800s, that they started to make protest and try and get laws passed or enacted which would lead to a more sanitized version of Christmas. Which I don't know why. I guess people just do not like being held ransom for figgy pudding and good cheer. And I guess people don't like their homes vandalized. Huh. Golly, people are so soft. In all seriousness, folks, I will say before we close out the video, you'll have to forgive me for being a bit of a jokester there. But in all seriousness, I will say before we close out the video that I thoroughly thank you for coming along on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you've enjoyed it. I also will say that if you are curious as to what Wassail is like and you wish to learn a little bit more history in regards to wassailing itself or to the actual recipe, then please feel free to check out the YouTube channel Tasting History with Max Miller. He does a wonderful video on this, diving a bit deeper than I have in today's episode. And he not only tells you a little bit more about the history of the wassail, as opposed to what I could, but he also shows you how to make your own wassail. If you don't have a bowl proper for such a festive drink, then go out and get one. But nonetheless, I will say that as for the beginning of the episode, we set out to find out what wassail is. And, well, we were able to accomplish that in some effect. We were able to discuss the history, the origins, and practices of the beverage, as well as to what it might have been like. But when it comes to the word wassail itself, unfortunately, we come close, but no cigar. Because we are looking at a multifaceted word here, which could reference a number of things. It could be a toast, a salutation, it could be the beverage itself, a party, or a drunken brawl. But I'll leave that up to you to decide what wassail truly is. And so, although we are left unsure as to the true meaning of wassail, I will say that what I am sure of is that you won't want to miss next week's episode. But until then, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum, signing off for now, saying goodbye and God bless.